Hi, I'm Vince Cunningham, Business Advisor with the China-Britain Business Council. My background's engineering, and my introduction to China was just over 10 years ago when I went to China to deliver UK technology and build a factory. I'm going to talk to you today about managing financial, legal and intellectual property issues in China. Now, as an engineer, I'm not an expert in those areas, but it's important for companies to have a basic understanding because you need to know when you have to have professional advice. I'm going to give a bit of background first of all, and then I'm going to talk through some headlines, a few slides on each, and I'm going to concentrate on what these areas mean to you. Then I'll summarise. First of all, the background. Well, China as we know it today is actually relatively new. Yeah, I was still at university when President Nixon made the first visit to China. The Cultural Revolution was on at the time. I had a little red book with Chairman Mao's sayings. And back in those days, China was a Soviet-style economy. There was a national policy to acquire intellectual property without paying for it, and Chinese borders were all but closed to commerce. That all began to change after the death of Mao and the end of the Cultural Revolution, and China actually only began to open up in 1978. And it's as recent as 2001 that China joined the World Trade Organization. Just take a snapshot in one area. Back in '79, when China was beginning to open her borders to investment and trade, there were 200 lawyers in China. Now, there are over 200,000. And that shows the rate of change that there's been in modern China. It also explains why in some areas I refer to things not yet being mature. But don't forget that China is still a single-party government. But if you look at those coloured areas on the map, each of those is a Chinese province, and those provinces have strong regional interests. Starting with currency and financial, well, the Chinese renminbi, sometimes locally called the yuan, is still a controlled currency. Yes, we can get it more easily when we travel from the UK these days, but it's regulated through the banking system by the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, SAFE. And if that sounds bureaucratic, it is. The banks are charged with making sure that payments or transfers into a foreign currency match contracts, that are related to contracts, match payments, or audited accounts if the dividends being paid to foreign companies. There is an increasing use of what's known as cross-border renminbi trading accounts, and banks like HSBC, Bank of China, will open them, let you open these, and they allow you to hold a renminbi account, to pay in China in renminbi, to receive in renminbi, and to make transfers with relative ease back to your bank in the UK in sterling or dollars or whatever it is. They're relatively new, and there are charges of about £1,000 a year for those. Turning to tax, well, the Chinese tax regime is broadly similar to ours. Enterprise income tax, a corporation tax as we know it, is a flat 25%, whether you're a foreign-owned or a Chinese company. There are some exceptions like 15% for approved and recognised high-tech companies. Dividends to foreign shareholders can be paid after the accounts are prepared, so that's annually, audited, taxes paid, and of course certificates proving that the tax is paid presented to the authorities. If you're dealing with technology, you may be into a royalties contract or a services contract, and payment for those will attract a withholding tax, normally 10%, and will probably also attract a 5% business tax, and those two are compounded. Now, there is a UK-China double taxation agreement. I understand it's pending, and looking on the HMRC website, it's listed as being in place but not yet enacted, not yet enforced. And it's very important, if you're getting involved in operations in China that involve any significant financial transfers, especially if you're investing, that you take the advice of a good qualified accountant with China connections. VAT, similar to ours, actually it's lower than ours. There are some rebates, and it's a sliding scale on exports from China, and these can change from time to time. If you're selling into China, of course there's VAT to pay. There is also almost certainly duty, and depending on what you're selling, there may well be a consumption tax. And these are all calculated based on the Unified Customs Code. There is some sensitivity in China about any manipulation of intercompany prices. And the Chinese do audit transfers, and the number of auditors that they have is increasing. So it's an area where, well, there may be some flexibility, as there always is with intercompany prices, but you need to be careful. And when employing people in China, well, first of all, it's illegal for a foreign company to employ a Chinese national if they don't have a registered company presence in China. And taxes due to people who work for foreign companies are collected by a government agency. The most common one is FESCO. With intellectual property, well, China's first intellectual property law was enacted in 1979. In 2001, China committed to the whole raft of international intellectual property agreements under the WTO agreement, but it's come from a very low base. And also in China, there is a cultural acceptance of copying. So the legislation that's in place broadly matches the UK, EU systems, the US, and they are signed up to all of the international agreements. So, for example, the Berne Agreement on copyright. They're revising the laws. The patents laws were revised in 2008 and brought up to date. The trademark law is under review currently, and it's actually under review to make it friendlier to foreign investors in China. Why are the Chinese doing this? Well, an obvious reason is they want to encourage trade and investment. Another reason is that China is increasingly generating its own intellectual property, and the laws are being enacted and enforced to protect Chinese companies as well as foreign companies. And if you talk to the authorities in any major city or any of the major development zones, they'll have their own intellectual property bureau, and they can be very active. And that photograph is illicit material being destroyed to the orders of one of the local intellectual property bureaus. So, with all of that legislation in place, all of those actions, is there a problem? Well, actually, you do need to be careful in China, because enforcement of intellectual property laws can be patchy. Short-term interests and regional interests can very often play a part. And there's an old saying in China, the emperor's a long way away. And that's as true today as it was in the days of the dynasties. A particular area to be careful with and to consult the relevant professional people, intellectual property protection lawyers, is trademarks. Because China is a first to register environment for trademarks, and if you go into the market and attract interest and somebody registers your trademark, then that registration process takes about a year. There's a further 3 years during which you can appeal, and beyond that it can be very difficult to recover your situation. Those bottles in the photograph are bottles of essential oil, things like oil of evening primrose. A UK company was selling these oils into China and had done so for about 10 years. They found there was a copycat website ripping them off, using their brand name and selling, well, goodness knows what they were selling in the bottles they were selling direct into the Chinese market. When they checked it out, a Chinese company had registered their trademark in the Chinese market 10 years before, and there was very little they could do about it. So please talk to people about protecting your trademarks before you go to China. Make sure that you know what's your core or your key intellectual property, because not everything that you're doing in China is essential to protect, and some of it you may be better off buying on the open market. When I took the technology to China and built a factory, only certain areas of our plant were important to protect. Take the advice, register trademarks and logos, but don't just talk to the lawyers. Make sure that you take practical steps. And the sort of things that you can do are being careful about what information you disclose, when you disclose it. Sign up partners with confidentiality agreements. Now, okay, I know that somebody can walk away from those, but the fact that you've sat them down brings it to the forefront of the mind. Be aware of what's going on in the market. So don't try and stay remote from China. Otherwise, by the time you find out what's going on, you won't like you won't like that information. Divide and protect. Well, do you need to do all of your work, place all of your orders with one company? Should you work with several companies? Perhaps do the final assembly and so on yourself. So make sure that you're holding something back, either by keeping some key IP in the UK, or make sure that you've got the integration of the various elements of the intellectual property, and only you have that. Now, I showed you the figure about Chinese lawyers early on, 200 to 200,000, and not much over 30 years. So it would be fair to say that the legal system's rapidly developing. And again, China has a whole raft of laws that broadly mirror those in our market and in other markets that we deal with. But the laws tend to be fairly simple, they can be ambiguous, and they can be open to interpretation. And again, when you consider that you've got perhaps the local or the regional interests, then you need to be careful about that that interpretation. So make sure that you're talking to the people where you're intending to set up or do business. The Chinese legal system is not, emphatically not, the same as Hong Kong. The Hong Kong legal system is based on English common law and will be so for about another 40 years. The Chinese environment, the legal environment, can be really quite regulated and bureaucratic. And a good example is to set up a company. You need to go through a whole raft of registration processes, get different licenses, and typically for a trading company or an operating factory, that process can take about 8 months. And something to be aware of when you are taking advice, well, you may well want to talk to a lawyer in the UK. Make sure that they have got good connections with China, because foreign law firms have to work through a Chinese law firm. Foreign lawyers are not allowed to practice in China, and foreign law firms are not allowed to practice in China. So make sure that whoever you are dealing with has got partners in China. Just touching on some areas where particular care is needed. One is employment law. Now, you need to have written contracts with employees in China. If you don't, there are penalties that can apply. Chinese employees in your company can have a 2-year tenure. If you're setting up a business, be careful how you word the business license, because it's highly specific. And if you're operating outside of that business license and you come to the attention of the authorities, they can, at a worst case, actually close you down. Working with contracts, bear in mind that contracts as we know them, where I look back on them and they tend to be tablets of stone. If we're changing something, we agree a variation to contract. They're regarded very often in China more flexibly than they are in the UK. It does depend on the experience that your business partner has in dealing with foreign companies, but people who don't have much experience with foreign companies, our form of contract may be quite different. Sometimes I've found people argue that to have a contract under a legal system that they know. Now, it could be English law, it could be Hong Kong law, I've come across them in Singapore law, That's the way to do it. But do bear in mind, if something goes pear-shaped in China, you have to sort it out in China. And Chinese courts are not going to accept some ruling under foreign law. Arbitration's important in China, and we would advise building an arbitration contract, we'd advise building an arbitration clause into your contracts. But again, do be careful and take advice, because arbitration in China can very often take the form of a negotiated settlement. Just a word on corruption. In China, it's illegal. Incoming Chinese leader Xi Jinping has declared that efforts will target both the flies and the tigers, the big companies and the small fry, in stamping out corruption. The way that the Chinese tend to operate with corruption is by example. So if somebody sticks their head too far above the parapet, the consequences could be extremely serious for them. There is a problem in that they don't dig beneath what is visible, much as we would do here. If you're tempted, be very careful, because it's a slippery slope and it leads to no-win situations. And the examples that I've been aware of, when I built my factory, there was one contract that I subsequently found out that money had changed hands to secure the contract. And it was the one contract I had absolutely no control over. And I've seen companies have to give up and actually quit an area when things get out of control. And don't forget that if you do anything that involves corruption with China, it's illegal in the UK, and you may well be liable when you get back home. So just summarising, with China generally, in these areas, financial, intellectual property protection, the legal area, the legislation's in place, but the system is new, it's immature. There's no external regulator, there's no EU in China, and it's a single-party government. National laws are often a little bit vague, and that leaves room for interpretation locally. Now, using a UK law firm or a financial or tax accountant, it can seem expensive. But at CBBC, we see the problems. And when there are problems, those mistakes are even more expensive than taking advice in the first place. This little book that we write jointly with staff from the embassy and consulates is a very good basic business guide to China, and there's lots more information on our website. There's a lot of support for UK companies in China, embassy in Beijing, consulates in Chongqing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and High Commission in Hong Kong. And at CBBC, we now have offices in 13 of China's strategic cities. We work very closely with UK Trade and Investment, and we deliver their business-to-business services in China. But we are a membership organisation, and membership provides flexible support throughout your journey in China. And we also have some specific services. Details of those you can find on our website. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you on the other webinars. Thank you.